the newsagents.
This is the White House Situation Room, getting to connect Prime Minister Starmer to President Biden. You are now connected to Air Force One.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, congratulations. What a hell of a victory. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's been a long night and day. I've been busy appointing my cabinet during the course of this afternoon. So thank you very much for your congratulations. And fortuitously, we will see each other next week. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in Washington and having the opportunity, obviously, to sit down properly.
I'm looking forward to it as well. There's no doubt that under your leadership, our two countries are going to continue our special relationship. We're working together just about every issue, supporting Ukraine, managing the competition with China, advancing cooperation in the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS.
Firstly, the special relationship is obviously the bedrock, always has been, for our defence, for our security and prosperity, which obviously is central to our missions for government.
You've got to wonder whether, for Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, that was the moment, being connected by the White House switchboard to Air Force One to speak to the President, when it all started to feel very, very real. We've got a new government, a new cabinet, and Keir Starmer is appointing the rest of his ministerial team. We've also got a Conservative Party leadership contest in its very earliest stages. There is so much politics to come and to talk about. Welcome to a whole new political era. Welcome to the newsagents. It's Lewis.
It's John.
It's Emily. And that call told us, first of all, that Keir Starmer heard the word special relationship from Joe Biden before he had to say them himself. It is quite a moment. And if you've seen the video, if you want to see the video, the first thing you notice is how curated that shot is. Absolutely beautifully lit, as all the shots that we have had in so far are. They've planned this. They've planned this to the nth degree. There is a Union Jack flag just quietly in the background of every single shot of the incoming ministers, secretaries of state. And this is something that hasn't happened accidentally. This is probably the result of having somebody like Sue Gray, having somebody like Morgan McSweeney planning out meticulously what that first day in power would look and sound like.
The thing that struck me about this clip that they put out of Biden and Starmer was that it was put out at all. It's very, very rare to see or listen. I was racking my brain to try and think of another example, but to actually record the one of these calls that they have, sort of first calls with a foreign leader, very, very rare, let alone with the president.
I've never heard anything like it before. And, I frankly, I was more interested in the whole mechanics of this is the Situation Room connecting you to the President of the United States, you're now connected to Air Force One, than I was the kind of the brief platitudes that were spoken between them. And I'm sure that they must have got permission from the White House to put it out, because otherwise that is a kind of big breach of protocol. I suppose the other thing, it was just the pinch yourself moment that, oh my God, power has transferred peacefully, swiftly, uncontroversially, and that there was a new person in Downing Street. And that was the sort of, wow, this has really happened, Prime Minister Starmer. I also thought that, the British have never been able to do West Wing because our politics doesn't lend itself, and neither does our television. And yet this was pure West Wing. The way that Keir Starmer was lit for the shot, it was just all utterly perfect. And it was the sort of, we could do the West Wing too, and this is how we're going to present it to the British people.
There was quite an interesting moment in the first press conference that he gave yesterday afternoon, where he was asked if he had got used to being called Prime Minister yet. And he answers that very straight. He says, look, you can call me Keir or you can call me Prime Minister, but I understand as far as the civil service goes, they will need to call me Prime Minister because they will have to remember that it is the office, not the man. And I think this goes to the heart of two things. One, that he is trying to reset this idea of the civil service somehow being, against the political class or somehow trying to undermine the political class. He's saying, I want to work with you. And the second thing is he's saying, This is about roles. We are all sticking to our lanes. This is not about personality. I don't actually want to have a government or a cabinet of strong, big personalities. I just want the thing to function.
Although I think it's been very striking that he's been using the language of the personal pronoun throughout. He's been talking about my government, what my government will do, what my ministers will do, which isn't always the formulation. Sometimes the king or the monarch gets a bit annoyed about that. But we're like 2 or 3 days in, and my overwhelming sense of everything from Labour ministers, including the one I interviewed this morning, the new business secretary, Johnny Reynolds, is just like they're giddy. Like they can't quite believe that it's happened. It has been such a long time. And for many like Reynolds, who has been an MP since 2010, so has literally only known the drudgery of opposition, they can't quite believe it's happened. This was the first thing I asked him when he was on my LBC show this morning was how it felt. This is what he said.
Really special thing. You're so tired, much like yourself, you haven't slept properly for the run into a general election. But
I don't have a new department
be able to walk up there.
Enough.
So you walk up. Seems a little bit unreal, and then go in conversation with the new Prime Minister in the cabinet room.
Yes.
They then take you in your new car to your department. So for me, the Department of Business and Trade is in the old Admiralty, across from where Trooping the Colour takes place. I have Winston Churchill's old room. The maps are still in place from the First World War, where the fleet would be moved around. I mean, you've got to enjoy that. Yeah, really special. But honestly, it was the most important thing is the sense of having an election where you're not then talking about opposition, the positions you will take, really delivering on the agenda. That is so exciting. And we've started immediately. I've been there every hour since, and I'll be going back there straight away after this interview.
And then after the sort of giddiness of talking about what it's like to have an office in the Admiralty building, we were just talking very briefly off air. I'm sure he won't mind my saying, but he was saying, asking him about what the transition like, and he was talking about it being like night and day, and the fact that he was talking about the transition in our system, which we've talked before about how brutal it is, how dramatic it is, in many ways how ridiculous it is. But he was saying, despite the fact that they're all completely and utterly knackered and exhausted, was saying that it does give you an impetus and immediate energy. Like literally he said on the Thursday, he was already negotiating with Tata Steel with regards to the Port Talbot Steelworks in South Wales and the proposed closure. So it's just that the transition from powerlessness to power is instant and complete and something to behold.
Yeah, I think that's the immediacy that they're not just. I mean, they're on the superficial level. There is the picture of them all going into Number 10 with their new red folders under their arms, as if they are kids for the first day of senior school, where they've got their satchels or their backpacks on and they're going into the classroom that they've never been into before with their new school uniforms. But I also think that, as well as the novelty, Keir Starmer has pitched it quite cleverly, in the sense of it's not a whole new dawn, is it not? It's not the kind of hope and dreams of Tony Blair. It's the gritty reality in 2024 of the sort of loveless landslide, as some are calling it, that he knows he's got a hell of a job of work, and it's kind of roll up your sleeves, and there are no instant solutions. And I think that pitching it at that level is probably quite smart. I was hearing from someone who had voted Conservative but was now saying they were quite pleased that Keir Starmer was the Prime Minister, because they feel that after kind of so much nonsense that has gone on over the past 14 years in terms of style of government, in terms of the chaos, in terms of the sleaze and all the rest of it, that actually welcomed this. And I think that very workmanlike, unperformative aspect of Starmer might serve him well, given the scale of the problems he faces.
You've got to feel for a man who sort of opens the papers and finds every single former leader trying to advise him what to do next. It's like he's just got this brand new car and everyone's trying to teach him how to drive it. And so you've got sort of first out the traps, Tony Blair saying, we've got to sort immigration, tick, we've probably got to do that with ID cards. And on the other side of the paper, you've got Vince Cable saying, the Lib Dems have got to stand in opposition to Labour and make sure they don't erode civil liberties. And so Keir Starmer's immediately kind of thinking, oh my God, are we back to the 2000s, where Tony Blair is trying to tell me we've got to introduce ID cards, versus the Lib Dems telling me that we can't, have all our details out and online. I do sort of feel actually for the guy who will now have to sort of plant his feet down to not be buffeted by all these older voices who are in some sense, trying to recreate and reincarnate what the battles that they have already fought. And some of that advice, I think, will be very good and very sound. And some of it probably hasn't actually moved on for our time.
Well, except, of course, as well, it's notable that obviously we've not had the full ministerial or the full list of ministers announced yet. The cabinet is there, which was more or less as it was, the shadow cabinet, with a few exceptions. Quite notable, I think, that Emily Thornberry actually didn't go into government as Attorney General. We'll wait and see what happened to her. Lisa Nandy is Culture Secretary because Tanguy Debonair lost her seat in Bristol. But on the sort of the first sort of the mid-ranking ministers that have come out so far, notable that they have actually brought back a few old faces. Douglas Alexander, who was a very big figure, particularly towards the latter end of the New Labour years, who's back as an MP, coming in as Minister of State at the Department for Business. Jackie Smith, which I think no one really saw coming. Jackie Smith, who was Labour Home Secretary under Gordon Brown, back in as a Department for Education Minister. And I think you can sort of see, and also on a non-political side, Patrick Vallance, who everyone knows, of course, from the pandemic, and James Timpson Timpson as a prisons minister as well. And I think there is a sense. Look, I think the reason for this is that Starmer is someone who prizes experience. He is keen to get the governmental machine working. And this does come back to actually a bit of advice I think Blair has given him in the past, actually, which is that, new ministers with no experience take a long time to get used to the government machine. And this is a government that knows, partly because it knows that its mandate, although big, is shallow, because it only got 34% of the vote. There is no great feeling of enthusiasm necessarily. It knows this is that delivery is the word that is sort of is just being emphasised again and again and again. So they can't afford to wait 18 months or 24 months or 36 months to get into their stride, which Blair basically feels about his first government. It has to start working quickly, and you can without doubt see the effect or the hand of Sue Gray, of course, who is now his chief of staff but was formerly at the top of the civil service machine, in that as well. So you can see some of these old hands being brought in.
What's really interesting is that I know Blair is rather fed up with the way his article has landed in the Sunday Times with this kind of emphasis on immigration and ID cards, because he was trying to write a more general piece, and the Sunday Times have taken one piece out of it and sort of made that the headline. And I think that they feel that they were trying to write a more, Blair was trying to write a more general supportive piece. There's one other name there that we haven't mentioned of these other people who have come in, which I think is significant, and that is that Alan Milburn is going to be playing a role with Wes Streeting. Now, Alan Milburn, when he was Health Secretary under Blair, was absolutely loathed by the left of the Labour Party because of his willingness to embrace reform, to embrace market solutions, the private sector, the need to take on some of the, the entrenched interests of the unions in the NHS. The fact that Wes Streeting is going to be working with him on the health service, I think is interesting, and I think it shows that some of the Blairite reform measures that were so kind of, Blair used to talk about how I've still got the scars on my back from trying to introduce public sector reform. Well, it looks like Keir Starmer, by having these sort of people put in prominent positions and prominent places, are going to be, thinking some pretty radical thoughts along the way.
Yeah, I mean, Alan Milburn, not to skate over this, has actually worked very closely with private healthcare companies since he left government. And I don't know if that will, stand him in good stead to make these kind of relationships, or whether it will actually get people's backs up. The one I think we've maybe just skated over a bit, and just to go back, is this appointment of James Timpson, which, on the surface of it looks incredible. You've actually put, somebody who knows about key cutting in charge of prisons. And it is an extraordinary thing, because James Timpson, who runs, all the Timpson sort of shoe rehealing, key cutting sort of spots that you see in train stations and tube stations and whatever, has had this policy of engaging ex-prisoners, ex-convicts, into the workforce in a sense of rehabilitation. So his whole sort of ideology is about what you can do after prison, or why prison doesn't necessarily work as the best solution for most people. Now, I just think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. We know that law and order is going to be something really important for Keir Starmer to get on top of. He's got all those reform MPs coming in. He's got the right of the party, the Conservatives. And what are we going to see with prisons? Are we going to see somebody who says, we're locking up too many people, which in a sense is the most obvious response, because we haven't got the prison capacity? Or are we going to see James Simpson saying, well, up to a point, but I've got to mitigate that with what we actually do? So I think it's a real headline appointment. That is a real kind of, I don't think any of us saw that coming. It's a genius appointment if it works, but I think it will be, it will be a hard one to sort of get across to people who think, oh, this is, Labour going all soft on prisoners and law and order again.
I think that there has been a distinct lack of triumphalism, considering the size of the majority. You compare it to sort of 97 and so on. There is less fanfare, there is less triumphalism. I think the reason for that is not just because of Starmer's political personality, because he's quite demure, politically demure in lots of ways. I think there really is an awareness of the scale of the challenge, not just in policy terms, but in political terms, in a sense that they are aware that the mandate, as I was saying, is big and they can do what they want, and we're all going to have to get used to a parliament that we've not had for basically 20 years, where the government's writ just runs wherever it likes. The parliamentary majority is unassailable. But obviously they are aware and concerned about vote share. They are aware about turnout, and they are aware of the sheer number of reform second places, particularly in the north of England. And there's some really interesting pieces in the papers today talking about the psychology around the people around Starmer. And I thought was most notable is the extent to which they've learned from the Biden example, in a sense that, yes, they have to deliver, and everyone is talking about delivery and the importance of delivery, and yet they're also aware that delivery in and of itself is not necessarily enough, because Biden has delivered in all sorts of ways through the Inflation Reduction Act. He's delivered on reindustrialisation in loads of ways. The economy, although it's got its problems, is in a much better state, and yet it still hasn't buttressed him in terms of his political position. There are other reasons for that. They're aware, though, I think, that they've got to start telling a story about their politics and what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And they have to have a specific set of rebuttals and attacks for Farage in particular. And there's this idea, and again, Jonathan Reynolds used it on my show this morning, on the LBC show this morning, where he started to basically associate Farage with he said that he is part of the coalition of chaos. He's got Liz Truss's economic agenda and he's got Putin's foreign policy agenda. And it was quite noticeable, I think, the extent to which that attack was so sharply made in a way that was not done quite as much during the campaign. But there is an awareness from Labour, the Conservatives have got to sort themselves out, but there's an awareness that they have to start honing their attacks on Farage now and start to put into place that what they have to say about themselves is just as important as what they're going to do. It's about showing and telling.
Well, in a moment, we'll consider Farage, the Conservative Party, who the new leader might be, and how they are going to address those questions.
One thing I think it's worth considering is just the texture and feel of what this new parliament will look and sound like, because we've got these 5 reform MPs coming in. Obviously, we've never had reform before. It hasn't existed as a party, except in the form of Lee Anderson Parliament, who came to it from the Conservatives. So that's going to be one kind of, I think, quite noisy romp. And then we've got these 5 independent candidates as well. You've got 4 independents plus, let's say, Jeremy Corbyn, who are all on the pro-Gaza wing. Now, there is a world in which that 10, are already at sort of loggerheads with where they think the positioning should be in terms of the Muslim voice, the Gaza voice, the Israel voice. I think that is going to immediately sound and feel very, very different. And we've got Keir Starmer having to face, I think, what no Prime Minister has ever had to face, which is a former leader back as an MP, essentially setting himself against him on many of the issues that he will be talking about now, whether he's pulling him to the left or whether he's sort of forcing him into a new position on the Gaza-Israel stance. I think this will all create a very sort of new, noisy feel to Parliament that we haven't really had a chance to think about yet.
There'll be noise, but in terms of the dynamics of the Parliament, will, as I was saying before, have to get used to the fact that, Starmer will never lose a vote. Like, we've not been in that place since 2001 to 5, right? Like, people talked about Johnson's big majority. Yeah, it was quite big, but it was 80, right? And it whittled the rat down very, very quickly. You only needed 40 Tory MPs, which isn't that many, to ensure the government would lose the vote if the opposition were united. Now you'll need, 80 Labour MPs? Unless Starmer does something terrible. It's not going to, and it's not going to make a difference.
In maths terms, I think that's right. But look at for example, Jess Phillips, is she feeling that extra pressure as she goes into government now? Look at people who have come very close to losing their seats. I mean, even somebody like Wes Streeting, just back in Ilford North with 500, 600 votes. Look at, as you've said, the 98 places where Reform came second.
Oh, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult.
You might not mathematically lose a vote, but is it going to be influencing Keir Starmer in how he directs policy? Because it has to happen.
But they'll be hoping, just on Gaza quickly, they'll be hoping obviously that by the 2029 election that issue is settled and long gone.
Exactly. I think that the Gaza issue is something completely different from the Reform issue. I think the Gaza votes have hit Labour in the 2024 election. It is a peculiar anomaly that presumably in 5 years' time, I mean, God knows where we are, please God, that there is, that there is no longer a war in that area and people are suffering in the way that they are. But it won't be it won't have the salience of an issue as it has in this election. Whereas the Reform issue is for real. There were 4 million votes for Reform and just 5 seats. And therefore, the Reform issue is something that will affect the thinking in a much more profound way of the way that the Starmer government behaves and what it does about immigration and the way it positions its arguments with the British people on what it's going to do about those sort of things, because those are for real issues. And it also is going to impinge on the Conservative Party and how it confronts the future, and whether, there are some people who seem to be saying there are 2 bricks. There is the brick of Conservative votes, and if you only could put the brick of Reform votes on top of it, we'd have won the election. And that seems to me a completely fallacious argument to be making, because, who says that if the Tory party suddenly moves towards the Reform agenda that you're not going to lose a whole slew of Conservative voters who say, thank you very much, not for me.
Well, there was one poll that was done just before the election which suggested only about a third. If when asking voters or Conservative Reform-inclined voters, if Reform were not standing in their constituency, that only about a third of Reform voters would therefore back the Conservative candidate, right? So this argument, which we're going to hear a lot of, particularly from candidates for the Tory leadership on the right of the party, which is all we need to do is, quote unquote, unite the right and put together Reform and Conservatives and Labour loses its majority. That isn't right, because as Labour are going to have to face up to and have to start making arguments against Reform really in a charged way for the first time, there are quite a lot of Labour votes there as well who wouldn't back the Conservatives. Farage is right about that argument. So it is that what to do about Reform is clearly going to be a big part of the Conservative leadership contest, which is already underway. We saw Robert Jenrick on the airwaves this morning. We've seen Suella Braverman's piece that she's written, Victoria Atkins also out on the airwaves, but it really is much more complicated than that. But obviously this question about what to do about Farage himself absolutely splits the Tory party down the middle. And I was speaking to Matt Vickers, who is one of the few Conservative MPs left in the north of England now. He's the MP for Stockton West. And he is a deputy chairman of the party. And I asked him whether he would welcome Farage personally into the tent.
I think, well, there are 2 things. I'm a fan of Farage. I think he's a politician who adds a great deal to the national debate. But actually, in real terms, what Reform achieved on Thursday evening was to help get more Labour MPs elected in a government with a huge Labour majority. And actually, what's that done for immigration in this country? What's it done for taxes? What's it done for many of the reasons people voted for Reform? Actually, the consequences mean that we're going to suffer greatly on those fronts.
Would you like to see Reform and the Conservative Party work more closely together?
I think people need to consider what they're voting for when they vote. They need to consider what the consequences are. The consequence of voting Reform on Thursday was to give the Labour Party an even bigger majority with a huge blank cheque that's going to have consequences for this country going forwards.
And Farage joining the Conservative Party, being invited in to try and unite the right, is that something the Tory party should we just be thinking about at some point?
I think it's probably for a discussion for somebody other than me, but I think previously the Prime Minister said that he would welcome Farage if he wanted to come and look at joining the party.
And so would you?
I would. Do you know what? We're a broad church. The broader the better.
But then later on I had Robert Buckland on, who lost his seat in Swindon, but nonetheless, basically said that he would fight to the absolute rafters to keep Farage out. So, there you go. It's Farage once again causing problems for the Tory party. It will be a live issue in this leadership campaign.
But I think right now, Farage is actually creating the bigger headache for Keir Starmer. And you would bet any money that immigration goes right to the top of Keir Starmer's list now. I mean, I think even before, Blair set out his bits of advice in the Sunday Times or whatever, this idea that Keir Starmer has to decide which of the two prongs he goes for. Does he make the case that the reform voter is right, that we do need to do something much more serious? He's ripped up the Rwanda plan. We know that happened on day one. But is he going to actually, stop the illegal immigration at this level, which is, what the reform voter wants to hear? Or is he going to sort of take on, as it were, the Lib Dem voter and make the case for immigration being an incredibly important part of our economy going forward? Now, everything we've sort of heard in the run-up has suggested he won't dare do that. He won't dare say, as they do in Scotland, we need more immigration, we need to run our services better, we need to welcome in more people because that's actually what's going to give us growth. We need to just sort of get the systems working again. I guess he doesn't do that, but there will be this really kind of complicated pull amongst his supporters and voters, half of which think he should actually be braver at saying, let's welcome in more immigration. And the other half will be saying, if you don't sort this out, if you don't give people a reason to take you seriously on immigration, they'll never vote Labour again.
Do you know what? I think I think that Starmer needs to make a more nuanced and complex argument than just that. I think that what you need to do is to have a much more honest conversation about immigration, which is something that British politicians have singularly failed to do, which is to say that on the paths of legal migration, we absolutely need people like that to run our care homes, to pick our fruit, to do all sorts of jobs that otherwise you struggle in the British economy to get them done. And look what happened when, after the end of the single market. Sorry, if you heard whistling there in the background, that was the dog shaking. There were no lorry drivers to drive the goods, and suddenly you had to bring people in. The other argument you need to make is that you have to be absolutely firm about illegal migration, and that you are going to take every measure to do that. And so you need to make the argument that legal migration that is controlled, that is filling jobs that are needed for the growth of the British economy, tick, yes, we want that. And illegal migration, we don't want. What the Conservatives did wrong was to keep saying, we are going to get net migration figures down to these ridiculously small levels. And that is where the failure took place. They couldn't do it.
What have you been doing to your dog, John? Yes, we should talk just a little bit about what happens next to the Tory party, right? Which is that, MP is going to be sworn in this week, and it is going to be quite the sight, and I think quite the shock for a lot of Conservative MPs, that are left of the 120 or so, many of whom have never known anything but government before, to see their political impotence, right, in the House of Commons, which will be physically displayed on the House of Commons benches because Labour will overwhelm the chamber. They'll be pretty spread out on the opposition benches, and they'll suddenly realise just how futile opposition can be. But the big debate that is currently going on within the Tory party right now is about the length of the upcoming leadership contest and whether they should play it shorter or go longer. The worry about going longer, which seems to be the place where I think people seem to be coalescing around, that would obviously benefit lesser known candidates perhaps rather than the more senior ones, is that they worry that basically what happened in 2010 to the Labour Party, where they had a longish leadership contest, happens. There's a sort of vacuum, there's no communication from the Conservative Party. It allows the Labour Party just to basically dominate the airwaves, say whatever they want. Likewise with Farage, because there's no kind of central force to the Tory party or critique. But the argument for going longer and maybe even having a so-called beauty contest over the Tory party in the Tory party conference in October is that it allows the party to have a more nuanced conversation about Scots, what has gone wrong, and perhaps allow people to emerge who might otherwise struggle in a shorter contest, which is basically what happened with David Cameron in 2005. Michael Howard stayed on for a long time, allowed that contest to go long. David Cameron emerged and won, which was probably the best result for the Tory party at the time. So that is the active debate that's currently going on within the Tory party, and poor old Rishi Sunak sat in the middle of it, who is going to have the very, very dreary job of being leader of the opposition until they make a decision.
Yeah, will he hang on? Will he actually hang on till October, or will he get out of there? Also, we should say that they've already named the date of the King's speech, July the 17th. So we will get that first sense of Keir Starmer's government's legislative plan in just over a week's time.
Yeah, and first PMQs on the 25th of July. So lots of fun to come.
Well, in France right now, they are voting for the second round in the National Assembly elections, where the centre, Macron's party, and the left have sort of formed a non-aggression pact and are hoping that that will thwart the far-right party of the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, from winning an overall majority in the National Assembly. So broadly, they are hoping that either we can have paralysis, which is what the most likely outcome is, otherwise the alternative is the far right, and people are hoping they can get paralysis instead, which is not exactly a happy place to be for the future of French politics and the future of Emmanuel Macron.
I think one thing that we're looking at is the fact that France, Germany, Spain up to a point have seen their right wing take off with younger voters. And that has been a real difference between what's happened here, where Farage and the reformists up till now have been very much a party for, dare I say, the elderly, the old white man party. If that starts to shift, if there are younger voices coming in to sort of re-energise Farage in the way that Jordan Bardella has to the RN in France, then I think there is a much, much bigger problem, because the enthusiasm gap is suddenly sort of, crunched, and you start seeing something that looks like the real energy of youth. At the moment, that isn't happening here, and we are waiting to see whether they will actually be victorious in France with a majority tonight. I would just say that France is quite good as a country at going right up to the edge of voting in the National Front, and then at the last minute sort of pulling it back and saving it. But I guess, all eyes are watching to see if that's true this time.
Well, it is a reminder again to say that on paper at least, Britain might end up being in a position of enjoying something which it has not been known for some time, which is some not inconsiderable political stability by comparison to Europe and the United States. And, although that will be difficult for Starmer to deal with, obviously French presidential election 27, Marine Le Pen will be favoured. We know what's going on in the US and so on. It'll be difficult for Starmer to deal with in lots of ways, not least on immigration and so on. But, if he's looking for growth, it might produce some economic dividend, because investment has to go somewhere. And we know there's going to be this big investment summit happening imminently that the Labour government is going to organise. And that will, I'm sure, be one of the pitches that Britain is once again can be relied on for political and economic stability, unlike some of our neighbours.
The strong and stable news agents will be back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.